On PrimeTime Politics tonight, federal help is on the way to Manitoba as that province's health system gets overwhelmed by a surge in COVID cases. Doctors in the province calling on the Premier to enact tougher restrictions. Federal representative for the Prairies, Jim Carr, will be here to discuss the federal response. More criticism of the federal government's handling of sexual misconduct in the military after DND's top public servant lays the failure squarely at the feet of government. MPs will debate the latest developments on that. And our panel of parliamentary journalists will be here to discuss military sexual misconduct and the Prime Minister's support for Quebec's constitutional changes. And let's begin with the latest on COVID-19 and the third wave in Canada. It's a very uneven story across the country where some provinces pushed on with increasing vaccinations and so on, are seeing a continuing decline in new infections and an easing of some restrictions. In some other provinces, tighter restrictions with new infections remaining stubbornly high. More than 50% of Canadians have now received at least one dose of vaccine. The federal government has responded to the urgent plea for help from Manitoba, now dealing with the highest infection rate in North America and dealing with an overwhelmed healthcare system. The federal government will send in epidemiologists and lab technicians, critical care nurses, all of that to help Manitoba deal with the crisis, and support from the Canadian military as well to speed up vaccinations.
For additional support to manage the situation, we're preparing to deploy federal health human resources. We're also looking at deploying medical staff through the Canadian Red Cross and sending support from the Canadian Armed Forces.
Meanwhile, the Premier of Manitoba is facing calls from a group of doctors in that province to take tougher measures, including a stay-at-home order and the closing of all non-essential businesses to drive down COVID infections as Manitoba ships COVID patients, 18 so far, to Ontario for treatment. But the Premier suggested today the current restrictions are enough. They just aren't being followed.
When you have vaccines available to everyone and yet 70% of the folks who are going into hospital haven't been vaccinated, there's an element of personal responsibility here and personal decision-making that impacts. And so I think it's clear that if you do an analysis of the restrictions across the country, you will see that we brought in more severe restrictions than virtually anyone else earlier in relative to case numbers than other jurisdictions from Quebec to the West Coast. And so the issue of regretting not bringing in earlier health orders may be raised, but the adherence to health orders is also a key issue.
Jim Carr is a Manitoba Liberal MP and Cabinet Special Representative for the Prairies. He's with me now. Minister Carr, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight.
Good to see you again, too. It's been a while.
Yeah. Can you give us more detail about exactly what help the federal government is going to be sending to Manitoba?
It wants more nurses. It wants transportation, logistics, more vaccinations in First Nations communities, more equipment, more help on the ground. Our system is stretched. We're having to send patients into Ontario, the possibility that some Manitobans will go even to other jurisdictions. The nurses, support staff on the front line, exhausted, and we need the help of the federal government. The Prime Minister has spoken to the Mayor of Winnipeg, Brian Bowman, Premier Pallister, on Friday. There has been a formal request for assistance. Governments are working on that now, right. And we will be there for Manitobans as we have from the start of this pandemic. We're going through a very rough time. Peter, there are so many cases in Manitoba now that every family will know someone who has picked up the COVID-19 virus. And that makes it personal. It brings it to the neighborhood. And it's what we're coping with right now. And
let me
federal
ask,
government.
Sorry, Minister. Let me jump in. Brian Pallister, the Premier's asked for 50 critical care nurses, 20 respiratory therapists, 50 contract tracers, the military to help with vaccine rollout in Indigenous communities. Manitoba officials saying today, look, we've been told we're getting 12 critical care nurses. So is that the start? And should he expect that he's going to get the 50 critical care nurses he's asked for?
There's a serious shortage across the country, as you would well imagine. At this moment, but we will do whatever we can looking at the system and looking at the possibility of other provinces helping. We know that the strains and the stresses are at a critical point. And it's very possible that over the next number of days, it could get worse before it gets better. So we are alert to what the requests are, what the capability is from the Government of Canada, and we're working very closely with Manitoba to make sure that we can provide what they need urgently.
Right. But it sounds like Premier Pallister might not get everything he needs just because you might have trouble scrambling those numbers from any
Yeah,
part
we're
of
going
it.
to do we're going to do whatever we can, and we understand how serious and urgent the threat is here, and we'll respond in the best way that we can.
Why do you believe the situation has become so acute in your province in Manitoba, to the point, as you've mentioned, where the ICUs are so stretched that they're now sending patients to Ontario, 18 so far? Why is it happening?
Well, we're going to have an awful lot of time to wonder how we could have done things differently during this pandemic. It came quickly. It came powerfully. We responded as best we could as a national government, humble enough to realize that we didn't get it all right the first time. And there will be plenty of time for people to assess what we've done and how we could have done it better. Now is not that time. Now is the time to make sure that the people who are most in need get what they require. And in the case of Manitoba, it's nurses, it's logistics. Right. The vaccines are rolling at a much better rate, and they will continue to. So we know that there is all kinds of good news ahead of it, but we have to double down on our discipline.
Okay, let me ask you about that. Doctors in your province today, a group of doctors calling on the Premier there, Premier Pallister, to introduce tougher measures, including a stay-at-home order, closing of all essential, non-essential businesses. Do you support those doctors in what they're calling for? Do you think the Manitoba Premier has done enough here to crack down on the spread?
The Premier will take his advice from his public health professionals. And that's the way it should be. There is always an easy road looking back to try to second guess what we have done or what we should have done. But again, now it's the time to respond. And the request has gone out to the Government of Canada. We have responded, and this isn't the first time. And as the Prime Minister has said, we will do what it takes for as long as it takes to keep Manitobans and all Canadians safe.
But you're sitting there in Winnipeg, and you're close to the situation. You've watched what's happened in your province. Do you think the Premier's done enough here? Is he following the right kind of? There seems to be conflicting advice coming from health experts in that province. Do you wish he was?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, do you wish he was doing more? Are you satisfied as a Manitoban?
I wish the situation was better. I wish that there were fewer people sick. I wish the positivity rate wasn't 15.9%. I wish that we weren't running out of ICU beds, but we are. And when you're living through a crisis and it's fluid and changing every day, the best use of your energy is to work collaboratively across the system, across governments, to get help to the people who need it most as fast as you can.
Some have suggested the federal government should be attaching conditions to help for provinces that get into this kind of trouble. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't know that this would be the time for that. Premier and Mayor have called the Prime Minister and said that we need this help now because our people are suffering because of an inability for us to keep up with the demand in the system. Well, that kind of is a bit of a conversation starter. So what you do is you find the resources where you can find them across the federal system and throughout the provinces, and you come up with what the Manitoba government says with good public advice, public health advice to give people what's needed immediately, and the priority that they have determined is what they need now, and that's what we're doing.
All right. Jim Carr, always good to get your perspective. Thanks for your time tonight, sir. Take care.
You're very welcome.
Well, candid and damaging comments from the federal government's top public servant at the Department of National Defence. Jody Thomas is the Deputy Minister of Defence, and she told CBC Radio that the operation to put an end to sexual misconduct in the military lost its way because the government failed to properly implement the recommendations of the Deschamps report 6 years ago. Thomas, who was appointed deputy minister in the fall of 2017, says the Deschamps report was treated like a checklist, but not truly implemented by the government. She says as little as possible was done to make it look like the report was responded to without any real change. The comments from Thomas come as the government is on the defensive over the handling of the sexual misconduct allegations against senior military officers, including the former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. I'm joined now by three members of Parliament to discuss the comments made by Jody Thomas. Anita Vandenbeld is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. James Bezan is the Defence Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Lindsay Mathyssen is the Deputy Whip and the Critic for Women and Gender Equality for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Anita Vandenbeld, let me start with you. Jody Thomas has painted a picture here in her comments of the military side running a checklist to make it look like change is happening and no one on the civilian side ensuring that real change was actually happening. So I'm wondering how badly do her comments undermine the government's stated commitment here to stamp out sexual misconduct in the armed forces?
Well, in fact, I think it reinforces it. What Ms. Thomas said is no different than what the minister has been saying, what the Prime Minister himself has said, what the Acting Chief of Defence Staff, is that successive governments have failed the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces when it comes to sexual misconduct, harassment, and assault, that there has been harm done, that many of the processes that we put in place did not meet their intended objectives, and that we have to do better, that we have to do more, we have to do it faster.
But she's specifically talking about the period after the Deschamps report was released, saying that there was, the civilians, so there was sort of an effort to make a checklist, but to make it look like stuff was being done, but that no stuff was being done. That's a real focus on the last 5 years in particular, and what didn't happen, isn't it?
And that is precisely why we need Madame Arbour and why we appointed Madame Arbour and General Carignan, because we know that this has to be done outside of the CAF, outside of the military chain of command and structure. That is very, very evident from what has been happening recently. We have done a number of things. We know that it's not enough, and what Ms. Thomas said is precisely the same as what...
All right, let's move to Mr. Bezan. But she's also raising not just the military side, she's talking about the oversight side, the civilian side not doing enough to make sure it was getting done. Mr. Bezan, what's your reaction to what Jody Thomas had to say?
I think Jody Thomas, her interview yesterday was really an indictment on the Liberal government, that there has been no political leadership here shown by Defence Minister Sajjan or Prime Minister Trudeau. They allowed the Deschamps report to sit on Minister Sajjan's desk for the last 5 years and collect dust. And as she said, they barely even referenced it as a checklist and only half-heartedly brought about some of the changes that were asked for by Justice Deschamps. So, here we have the Canadian Armed Forces that are being rocked by this crisis of sexual misconduct by some of our top commanders. And the Liberals have sat on their hands and they're punting down any decisions down the road, kicking the can, as they say, so that they can put this off until after the next election, and then maybe they will deal with it. Our men and women in uniform deserve better. They deserve some real leadership coming from the political levels. Okay. And right now, all we have is people passing around the hot potato and not taking responsibility or being accountable for not taking action on sexual misconduct in the armed forces.
Lindsay Mathyssen, what's your reaction to this frank assessment of failure, I think, provided by Jody Thomas?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's clear, and actually this isn't the first time we've heard it. I've been sitting on the Status of Women Committee, and this isn't the first time we've heard about checking of boxes, and that the government ultimately, they have had 5 years. They've sat on the Deschamps report, and they haven't done what's necessary. They've done, in fact, what Ms. Thomas said, the bare minimum to look like they were the true feminists that they continue to claim that they are. But women don't need another report. And with all due respect to Justice Arbour and General Carignan, these are fantastic, incredible leaders and women, and I know that they will do a good job, but it's just another report. And there are already reports. There's the report from Deschamps, Madame Deschamps. There's a report from the Auditor General. There's a previous report from the Status of Women Committee, and the government has done nothing. and they will not show the leadership that women serving in the armed forces need so that they can serve equally.
Anita Vandenbeld, the opposition parties these things are intertwined here, want to call the Defence Minister's former Chief of Staff and the Minister of Defence back to committee to testify about the handling of the allegations of sexual misconduct against General Vance. You and your colleagues on the committee are refusing to let that motion come to a vote. So do the comments from Jody Thomas suggest there are more questions to be asked about just how seriously the minister's office took the concerns about misconduct?
Well, first of all, the Defense Committee has already done over 26 hours of additional meetings in addition to our regular sittings. And we've heard the same thing from almost pretty much all of the witnesses, that people acted in good faith. There wasn't enough information to investigate. But what I would go back to is
but let me just ask in this context, though. You have Jody Thomas, the deputy minister, saying boxes were checked, and the idea was to look like stuff was being done, but it wasn't actually being done.
Which is
but hang on, does that not present a potential line of questioning for the defense minister to bring him back to committee and say, look, I want to know how that approach to dealing with sexual misconduct informed your thinking around how you handled General Vance?
Well, first of all, she said nothing more than what the defense minister himself has been saying, both before committee and elsewhere, what the prime minister, what the chief of defense staff have all been saying. What she said was not new. What it does, though, is it reinforces the need that we can get the report finished so that we can get those important recommendations from both committees that really matter to the women and men in the Canadian Armed Forces. Get those recommendations also into the hands of Madame Arbour. Madame Deschamps herself said that she welcomed Madame Arbour's study because it went broader and it was more detailed than what she did.
Fair enough,
in fact, what Madame Deschamps did the how, the what, the how is what Madame Arbour is going to tell us.
Let me move to Mr. Bezan. Mr. Bezan, do Jody Thomas's comments suggest to you there's a need to probe further with more Defense Committee hearings? Because it looks like you may not get them.
No, there's no question that we need to hear from her and Zita Stravis in particular, since they know things, and we'll be able to straighten out some of the contradictions from all the witnesses we had, including, Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, Katie Telford, Elder Marquez.
Just to be clear for our viewers, Zita Stravis is the former Chief of Staff.
Former Chief of Staff. Yeah. That's Mr. Sagen. And we need to find out exactly what happened with the flow of information here. But, what we have is the Liberals' ongoing filibusters and suspensions of committee meetings. We have spent days in suspension rather than actually dealing with the issues at hand. They would rather filibuster having Zita Stravis appear in front of committee than actually go out there and address the report so that we can get down to the brass tacks of fixing things up for the women and men who serve in uniform. And, as we were talking earlier, we got the Deschamps report. We are going to have these reports coming forward from committee. We don't need another report. We need results. And that's what the troops are wanting from parliamentarians. That's what they expect from their political leadership, including Minister Sagen. And that's what they expect from their leadership within the armed forces, is start addressing this and let's fix it now.
Lindsay Mathyssen, you're not on the Defense Committee. You're on the Status of Women Committee, which has also been holding these kinds of hearings. But do you think there are more questions raised by what we heard from Jody Thomas or not?
I think that there's a lot of questions unanswered, and I hope that the Defense Committee can finish the business so that they can get to the report. I know that just another announcement of a report isn't enough. We do need that action. I just don't know if the government will actually listen.
All right. Well, we'll continue to follow the story and see where it takes us. Thank you all for your time tonight. Appreciate it. And take care. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you all. Let's bring in three colleagues now from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Susan Delacourt is a columnist for the Toronto Star, Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse, and John Ivison is a columnist for the National Post and Ottawa Bureau Chief for Post Media. Good to see you all. Susan, let's begin with the comments from Deputy Minister Jody Thomas at the Department of National Defence, telling the CBC essentially that the failure to put an end to sexual misconduct in the military lies squarely at the feet of the government. The civilian overseers who did, as she put it, as little as possible to make it look like the report was responded to, but without any real change. What's your reaction to what she's saying?
My jaw dropped. I was quite surprised by these remarks. So either she is saying, I keep wondering, did she do this with any kind of approval from the top? Because it certainly seems like what she's saying is somebody wasn't doing their job here. She's not saying it was not her doing it, but it's hard not to draw the conclusion she's saying in there the minister wasn't doing his job, which is a remarkable thing to say for a public servant. And it's hard to tell whether this signals something inside the government, a mood changing about somebody having to take the blame for this. But I was quite struck by it.
All right, Joël-Denis, what did you think? And does this change the narrative at all with the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister? They've already taken their hits over this. Do they take more because of this?
I think it does create more turmoil for the armed forces, but now the Liberal government is drawn into it, and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defence are, sort of in the line of fire, if I may say, for not doing enough. And I would add to what Susan said, this kind of statement, I think, will probably push the government to do more than less in the future report that is expected by the former Justice Louise Arbour. When she comes down with her report, we will be expecting the government will move swiftly and in a broad way also to bring the armed forces into the, I may say, 21st century in terms of respecting gender equity in the armed forces.
John, how did you see it? I mean, I found it interesting looking at it because I thought it turned a bit of a corner here from the sense that, the well-meaning efforts of the Defence Minister and the Prime Minister to make change at DND, and it didn't happen the way we hoped it did. This seems to be more of we actively sought to do as little as we could.
Well, I took it a little bit differently than my colleagues. I think it was a bit of an internal power grab, in that we know that the twin towers exist in the Department of National Defence, one side being civilian and the other side being military. And I thought Jodie Thomas was essentially saying this was left to the military and they ticked some boxes, but they didn't actually do anything about it. And now we've got a new report which is going to come out with recommendations, and it should be the civilian side that oversees any future culture changes. That was my takeaway. I may be wrong on that, but that was what I thought.
All right, let's move along. Joël-Denis, let me start with you on this. The Prime Minister repeated his support today for Quebec's push to rewrite a section of the Constitution to say Quebecers form a nation and that French is the only official language of Quebec. He's getting some pushback from other parts of the country and from some columnists in Canada. Why is the Prime Minister on side with Quebec on this?
Well, there is an election on the horizon, and the Prime Minister does not want to create any waves that could prevent him from winning more seats in Quebec. So a lot of it, we could see it through the prism of elections and wanted to make some gains in Quebec at the expense of the Bloc Québécois and stop any resurgence of the Conservative Party. But this is clearly an electoral strategy on the part of the Prime Minister, because we would have expected Mr. Trudeau to make a little bit more of a pushback in normal circumstances, if I may say, but it's not the case because we're not in normal circumstances. An election is approaching, and also the Prime Minister wants to make gains, and the likeliest province where he can make those gains is in Quebec.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Susan, we could have an election in the next few months. Liberals hold 35 of the 78 seats in Quebec, and winning a majority would likely require winning more seats in the province of Quebec. Is that what this support from the Prime Minister is all about?
I don't think you can read, I think JD is right. There's a lot of electoral calculations in this, but I think you've also got to see it, you can't help but see it, I wrote this last week, through the long lens of history too. This is the son of Pierre Trudeau. And it almost seems like he is going to enormous lengths to be different from his father. And where his father, this might have sent him into, a maison egg roll speech, or you have to, I'm a constitutional survivor, so I know all these references. I think I was really struck by the way today he was asked, do you want to explain your defense of this? And he said, basically, no.
Right.
I stand by it, and that's that. And I think for all of us, just who were in the constitutional wars, I think we need to know a little bit more about what this all means. I don't think that this is just where it's going to be left.
John, let me turn to you here. You've been in contact with a well-known federal constitutional expert who has often challenged Quebec over the Constitution, but what's he saying about this?
Yeah, so Stéphane Dion, who's now our man the EU, and he's the ambassador to Germany too. So I asked him what he thought, and he said, well, surprising to me, if the Prime Minister's getting advice that they can do this unilaterally through Section 45 of the Constitution, and that it doesn't have an impact on the rest of the Constitution, then there's no reason to oppose it. Now, we then discussed a very similar instance in 1997 where Quebec wanted to unilaterally get rid of religious school boards and replace them with linguistic ones. And that became a bilateral amendment. It actually required an act in Parliament, which Dion sponsored, and it passed through Parliament and therefore amended the Constitution. And he used Section 43. And it would seem to me and to a whole bunch of other people that that would be a good way to go here, that you should get parliamentary assent or consent before amending the Constitution unilaterally. The problem with that, of course, is that you may not get it. I would imagine there are a lot of MPs who would not be happy with this, and therefore it might not pass, and therefore it might upset Quebec, and that might not end well for Justin Trudeau.
Joël-Denis, do you think this becomes a significant election issue? I mean, if it appears to divide the country, what are we in for?
Well, it could pit Quebec against the rest of Canada if the kind of reaction we've seen in some provinces keeps getting harder and harsher. But in Quebec, the Prime Minister's position has been seen as being welcomed by many people. But clearly there is some pushback by some English commentators and some English media. And also one surprising reaction was the one from the Alberta Premier, Jason Kenney. He said he endorses such a position. Maybe that means that Mr. Kenney may be looking at some kind of constitutional modification of his own he would like to do for Alberta. For example, protecting natural resources from any further taxes from Ottawa. That could be within the realm of possibility. Yeah, it could be endless for Mr. Kenney.
What do you think, Susan? Does this become an issue in the campaign whenever we get it?
I think that Justin Trudeau will be trying to do it the best he can for it not to become an issue. But I was really surprised by Jason Kenney's remarks too, and I wondered what we're opening up. Some of us had a lot of fun covering the Constitution back in the days, but I don't think this round would be as much fun.
What do you think, John?
Well, I think, the proviso that Dion made, and I think that Trudeau has made, is that the linguistic rights of the minority have to be protected in Quebec. And so therefore any concrete measures by Kenney or others to make English the preferred language in their province, or the only language, the official language, would still have to protect minority language rights. So maybe there is no concrete implication, and maybe it's just symbolic, and maybe it just is a non-issue.
All right. Thank you all for your time tonight. Good to talk to you all again, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of PrimeTime Politics. I'm Peter Van Dusen. From all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching. See you next time.